Well, after this day and a half of intense reflections and fruitful debates, we are coming to the end of this conference with this third plenary, where we will precisely talk about governability in Latin America and the challenges for the future. But I would like to remind you that you can follow the event through the World Bank webpage in vivo.bancomundial.org, and you can also follow by using the hashtag Cuentas Claras. I will introduce the moderator for this third plenary. This is Deborah Wetzel, the main director for the governance global practice of the World Bank. She was previously director of strategy and operations of the Middle East and North of Africa region, and she worked as director of the World Bank for Brazil. During her long career in the World Bank, she has worked in Central and Eastern Europe, Ghana, Russia, the old Soviet republics, Eastern Africa, and Zambia. She has a master's of the Johns Hopkins University in the Advanced International Studies. She is the author of publications about fiscal decentralization. I give you Deborah Wetzel. Buenos días. Después de una...
We've explored a whole variety of challenges to governance and how it contributes to economic growth and improved equity. We've looked at the inner workings of government in terms of financial control, in terms of budgeting, in terms of how different agencies exert their influences. We've looked at the judicial branch, and we've explored a whole series of areas in ways in which they have made advances in their work, but also areas that pose challenges. We've also looked at the issue of trust in government and the lack of it, and how different countries and societies in the region are seeking to reach out and provide information to their citizens, and how citizens are responding to that, and the interesting new innovations and technologies that allow that to happen, and the ways in which we might strengthen those further. So our last panel today looks quite broadly at issues related to the challenges ahead and how we might think about those. We have an esteemed set of speakers. We will first hear from Mitchell Seligson, who is a Centennial Professor of Political Science and the Professor of Sociology at Vanderbilt University. Professor Seligson is the founder and senior advisor of the Latin American Public Opinion Project, which conducts the America's Barometer survey. The results of these surveys help to provide a starting point for our discussion. We will then turn to Marie Kiviniemi, the Deputy Secretary of the OECD and former Prime Minister of Finland, to Kevin Casas Zamora, Senior Fellow and Director of the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law Program in the Inter-American Dialogue and former Vice President of Costa Rica. We will hear from Haroldo Cedras, Minister and President of the Tribunal de Contas de União, the TCU of Brazil, and from Luis Alberto Portorizo, Senior Advisor for the Strategy and Organizational Development Unit in the Organization of American States. So we have international actors, we have participants in the domestic scene in many countries to give reflections on how we may go forward and think about the challenges ahead. So let me turn to Professor Seligson now to start us off. Thanks very much.
Me toca darles una visión desde abajo. Hemos oído mucho de parte de las personas que gobiernan, pero ahora vamos a escuchar un poco de la gente. Y es una visión de la democracia y la gobernabilidad desde la lente del barómetro de las Américas. Y voy a repasar como 10 años de datos de 2004 a 2014 en poco tiempo.
2014 in a short time. So the study was funded mainly by Oecd and the University of Vanderbilt. Data source is over 250,000 interviews. Only in 2014-15 we interviewed in 28 countries over 50,000 people. It's the only source of data that covers North America, Central America, and South America. You will see that there are some places, such as Greenland and French Guiana, that is not independent, and Cuba, which we hope this next year we will try to incorporate. The samples are about 1,500 people per country, and they represent both urban and rural populations, rich and poor, old and young alike, and all the range, and women and men, etc. And the surveys are face-to-face at the homes of the respondents. By looking back at the decade of barometer of the Americas, we find the good news is that the support of democracy in abstract is relatively high and stable. We notice here, and we should consider, that the score in this question, the question of Churchill, the democracy may have problems, but it is better than any other form of government. And a scale from 0 to 100, and I will present everything from 0 to 100, this is about 70. It doesn't change a lot. So it's not that people do not agree that democracy should be the system of government. But when we try to find more precision, we will talk about satisfaction with democracy. Satisfaction with democracy, however, is far lower. Remember that we have here almost 70% every year, and here we have satisfaction that goes from 70 to 50, goes down to 50, and it does not get better. And in the last year, 2014, it went down. In general, you should say that you are satisfied or very satisfied with democracy. That was a question. And now we want to understand why that gap between the belief in democracy and satisfaction with it. And I will give an initial response. Trust in government institutions is low, and it's not growing. Here we have a graph of 4 institutions that are the most important: the executive, the national legislature, the parliaments, the justice system, and local government. None of them go beyond 50, and all of them are going down. The trust in the institutions with political responsibility is especially low, and it's going down in a very fast manner, especially the trust in elections. As you can see here, trust in political parties is not close to 70 or 50, but around 30%. And trust in elections is going down drastically. Since 2014, it's gone from since 2004 to 2014. But there's a lot of variation. We're in Uruguay here. There's a lot of trust in elections here. Uruguay earns the prize of the highest score, and Chile and Ecuador, Costa Rica. But then on the other side, Mexico with 39, Jamaica with 37, Brazil with 34, thinking about what's happening in Brazil right now. Colombia and Haiti is less than 30, and that is by country. The only institution that generates higher trust is the armed forces, and much higher than the police. Here we have the trust on the police and on the left, and armed forces on the right. The armed forces are the most respected institution, and the police that has daily contact with people is under 50, and in some cases 48, 47, etc. In negative, on the negative side. So what could be limiting and eroding the trust in the institutions? And this is what I will try to explain. One thesis is the insatisfaction with the rendering of services. We are only considering one point, crime. In 2004, the biggest problem, in our opinion, what is the most serious problem that the country is facing, was economic aspects. That has gone down. What has increased is the concern about crime. And that is increasing. Crime is an increasingly bigger problem for Latin America, the people in Latin America, the continent, and the Caribbean. That is has become more violent, concerning violence in the world, and fear reflects that. Here we have a question talking about the place or the neighborhood where you live and thinking about the possibility of being assaulted or robbed. Do you feel very safe, somewhat safe, etc.? And you can see that insecurity grows between 2012 and 2014. And now we have a test, a very specific test about the reaction of people concerning their police. Imagine the following situation. Suppose someone enters your home to burglarize it and you call the police. How long do you think it would take the police to arrive at your house on a typical day around noon? That's a question. And the answer is this. Only 12%, and I'm imagining that the criminal is inside your home. Only 12% say that they would arrive in 10 minutes or less. Between less and 30 minutes, 29%. And the majority of the people say over half an hour, 1 hour, over 3 hours, or simply there is no police. They will never arrive because there is no police. So this is a vision from the bottom up concerning governance. The police services are also seen as better for some people than for others. The response time of the police seems to discriminate by wealth and by gender. Here we have this question in horizontal, less than 10 minutes, 10 to 30, etc., and over 3 hours. And on the left, the vertical, we have the wealth quintiles of the households. It's very noticeable that among the richest homes, they report that the police comes earlier, and the poorer, that the police takes longer, or they just don't arrive. And there's a big gap between men and women. If it is a woman that calls, they will not arrive so quickly as when it is a man. So it's not surprising that the satisfaction with the public services is tightly connected with trust in the local, national, and government institutions. We created a scale with the following: the satisfaction with roads, public schools, and public health. And here's the relation between extremely insatisfied to very satisfied with the trust in the red line and concerning national institution, and trust in the municipal government with the same pattern. More satisfaction, more trust in the institutions of the local and national government. However, despite this negative opinion, citizens want an active government, and it's not just in Uruguay or Chile and Argentina. There's a general pattern in all of the Americas. Chile in the first place in this question. Should the government implement policies to reduce income inequality between the rich and the poor? What should the government do? In the first place is Chile with 85, and the one to last is Panama with 861. So it's all positive. Only my country, the United States, is in the negative, on the negative side. Another indication. The state, more than individuals, should be primarily responsible for ensuring the well-being of the people. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? Why is 87%, Suriname 85%, reaching Canada? All of them are positive until the United States has 42, the only exception. So people want an activist state. Why don't institutions deliver? And that's a question. I will give you 4 explanations quickly. The first one is that politicians are perceived as corrupt in a consistent and broad manner. We have talked a lot at this conference about corruption, and the question is, considering your own experience or what you have heard, corruption among public officials in the country is very common, etc. Here the score is about 70, and it doesn't change. There's a generalized opinion that public officers are corrupt. Public officials are corrupt. Second, adding to the frustration of citizens is that the patterns of race discrimination persist in almost all the countries. We note the color of the skin of we wrote down the color of the skin of each person that answered the survey with a color palette from very light to very dark. And when we correlated this with the wealth of the home, and you see a very strong relation. On the left, the lighter skin color, higher wealth. On the right, darker face color gives a result of lower wealth, and you notice that very clearly. 3. The quality of services, police response time, for example, shows evidence of perceived race discrimination as well. We have the same thing, time of the police from 10 minutes to 3 hours or no arrival, and the color of the skin. While the color is lighter on the left, they will reach in 10 minutes. As the color gets darker, the response time will be longer. 4. Worse still, there is little hope of escape from generational inequalities. Social mobility remains constrained as mothers' education determines to a large extent their children's education and income. And here we have a graph that is the level of education of the mother and the education of the respondent, and the mother's level of education and personal income. And you notice that mothers without education produce children with primary education. Mothers with higher education produce children with higher education. And the same with the income. Income is much higher if the mother has higher education. Finally, and this is where I will end, all these factors explain where I started from, why there is little trust on the institutions in spite of the support for democracy, and that is because these factors such as the lack of response of the police, and we could talk about roads, public health, etc., erode trust. And we have here 4 lines. Support to the system, support in the justice systems, trust in the national police, satisfaction with democracy. And the 4 lines show the same trend. If the police arrives quickly, so trust is about 60-65. If the police takes 3 hours or more, it will be around 30, 35, or 40. So there's a direct relation between what the citizen receives and their trust on institutions. And I will finish with that to hear the comments.
Thank you so.
Muchas gracias, doctor Seligson. Vemos los temas de seguridad, discriminación, transmisión de pobreza.
In the perceptions and in the reality for people on in their day-to-day lives. And so now we'll turn, and that affects their views on how government is responsive and is performing and delivering services that they are meant to provide. So we'll turn now to Mari Kiviniemi, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD and former Prime Minister of Finland. Many of us look to Finland as a country that has managed to address some of these issues of inequality. They're known as an example of a country that has among the best educational results in the world. And so it will be very interesting to hear Ms. Kiviniemi's views on the experience that she's seen in facing and confronting the challenges of good governance and its contribution to growth.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, happy to be here and share the OECD's views on inclusive growth and trust. And thank you also to Professor Seligson for his very interesting presentation. And I would like to also congratulate him and his team at the Vanderbilt University for over a decade of producing and sharing a laptop. I'm sure that these policy insights are very valuable for all of you and for all of us, and they really are a key source of information for everyone in this room. So thank you for that. In this presentation, it was good to know that there were also good news. Happy to hear some good news that support for democracy is high and holding steady in the Americas. But then, of course, when we have a look at the bad news, the satisfaction with the way democracy works is far lower and shows no sign of increasing. So those are news what we really wouldn't like to hear. This dissatisfaction is reflected in low and declining levels of trust in government. We just saw the figures: 49.6%, national assemblies 41.2%, and the justice system 43.8%. And trust in political parties comes last. I'm very well aware of that, being chair and also vice chair of my party. Same figures about in Finland, 32.2%. So these numbers in the Latin America, they are not that different from the OECD context. Firstly, trust in governments is declining. The average confidence in national government in OECD countries stood at 43% in 2015, still below pre-crisis levels. And this means that the majority of the population in OECD countries doesn't trust governments. In countries including Spain, Portugal, also my own home country, Finland, it has fallen by more than 20 percentage points. And of course, these are countries, especially Spain and Portugal, but also partly Finland, which have been hit hard by the financial crisis. Secondly, confidence in key public institutions is also low. Confidence in the judicial system stands at 53%, while trust in the national assemblies and political parties stand at 50.2% and 36.4% on average. These numbers are sobering. All our key institutions suffer from low trust: governments, parliaments, political parties, media, corporations, banks. So we really need to ask ourselves, is this sustainable? And I think that we all know the answer: no, it is not. Let's not forget that public trust is one of the most precious assets a country can have. It is the cornerstone of effective governance, the main ingredient to promote economic growth and social progress. Without trust in government, no policy, no reform will be ambitious or effective enough to achieve more prosperous and equitable societies. There are also direct economic costs and social costs to low levels of trust. Economic costs include lack of compliance and higher levels of risk aversion. The tremendously high social costs encompass social unrest, lower voter turnout, alienation of certain social groups. As we can see looking at current political developments, now more than ever our countries are running dry of this precious asset. Across OECD countries, our citizens have doubts about their government's capacities to make the right decisions, and increasingly, many groups feel disconnected: the youth, minorities, immigrants, women. It is high time to take action and rebuild confidence in the institutions that make our democracies. So what is driving the declining levels of trust in public institutions? We saw in Professor Seligson's presentation, he pointed out to some key factors that could be driving the declining levels of trust, including dissatisfaction with service delivery, perception of corruption. Almost 71% of respondents perceive public officials as corrupt. That really is a high figure. Issues of fairness. And these all issues focus our attention right back on the core theme of this conference, public governance. Public governance is the essential foundation for restoring trust in public institutions. When policies are designed without transparency and stakeholder consultation, not enforced fairly, or when policy outcomes are not evaluated, we undermine the foundation for trust. In the past few years, the OECD has been devoting increased attention to the issue of trust. We know that governments care about it. Nearly 3/4 of centers of government in OECD countries regularly monitor trust indicators, and more than half have recently commissioned studies in this field. But policymakers are still lacking actionable advice on how to retain or rebuild trust. In order to help identify the right mix of policies, the OECD has developed a framework for deconstructing trust in public institutions centered on competence and values as complementary building blocks for public trust. So what do we mean by competence and values? Competence means that governments have the operational efficiency, the ability and the capacity to perform their mandates. A competent government exhibits responsiveness through the provision of accessible, efficient, and citizen-oriented public services. An example of this includes adopting a live event approach to services, such as in France. It can help better map both business and citizen concerns, as well as understand bottlenecks. Values refer to the underlying intentions and principles that guide actions, policies, and behaviors, and it will also act to minimize uncertainty in the economic, social, and political environment. A values-driven government will align its institutions with the highest standards of transparency and integrity. It will also seek openness and meaningful engagement with society and taking broad stands to ensure fairness and safeguard the public interest. Mexico has been successful in translating the principles and values of an open government in practice through the use of an online tool to report on the outcomes of the Open Government Partnerships Action Plan. Through it, people can monitor the progress of implementation and also contact the public official in charge. This has led to a 100% completion rate
unique in the history of open government's partnership. And as you can see, these points certainly relate back to those raised by Professor Seligson. So how can the OECD help governments rebuild trust in public institutions? With this framework in mind, what is required to re-engineer public institutions and services to inspire trust? Let me share with you some policy tools with which the OECD is actively working on with countries. And here I will focus on three areas: improving access and quality of public services, strengthening integrity, and better understanding trust. So first, improving access and quality of public services. Access to services is essential to connect people and businesses with opportunities to achieve higher paid jobs, better living standards, and longer, more fulfilling lives. In addition, better quality public services can lead to more satisfied users, which over time is positively associated with trust in government. The combined power of regulation, digital government, and public sector innovation can render public services more accessible and efficient and lead to more satisfied users. An engaged, professional, and diverse public sector workforce also matters in shaping and delivering better services and overall government performance. In the region, we are currently working with Chile, Mexico, Peru, and the Dominican Republic on these topics. For Chile, we are currently conducting a baseline review on public sector innovation. So second, integrity. Integrity is key to restoring trust. There's a high number of citizens who believe that corruption in government is widespread. According to data showcased in our 2013 Government at a Glance publication, is 3/4 of the population in the US and almost 90% in Italy, Greece, and Portugal. According to the 2011 Transparency International Eurobarometer, almost 50% of respondents view their political parties as corrupt or extremely corrupt. At the OECD, we help countries to strengthen trust in the policy-making process by turning knowledge into guidelines and principles in high-risk areas. This includes, for instance, public procurement, which accounts for 13% of GDP on average in OECD countries. It also encompasses lobbying. Spending on this more than doubled over the past 15 years, increasing from US dollars 1.44 billion to 3.30 billion. Our work with supreme audit institutions in the region is one of our flagship initiatives in this crucial area. The OECD is also supporting Mexico's Office of the Auditor General in developing a strategy for evaluating systemic control deficiencies related to fraud and corruption. We are helping the office to advance coherent government-wide approaches to control and risk management. So third, and let me conclude by telling about the third area, better understanding trust. The work, what we have done to better understand trusting behaviors and drivers of trust, we are doing it by combining context-specific analysis at the country level, but also the policy level with new measurement efforts on trust. In education, for example, we focus on understanding the mechanisms by which education fosters both institutional and interpersonal trust, as well as the interaction between trust and the performance of the education system as a whole. In tax policy, we focus on designing tax policies that promote voluntary compliance over enforcement and ensure that the burden of taxation is considered fair and monies are used as stated. In the private sector, our emphasis is on how it can re-establish trust through greater compliance to business standards, complemented by more effective enforcement. With regard to public governance, we are working on national case studies that allow us to apply our framework and enrich it with the social and historical context, which also matters for understanding trust. And finally, we think existing measures of trust can be improved and thus generate more useful information for policymakers. Working together with statistical offices of member countries, we will develop the OECD guidelines on the measurement of trust, aiming to help governments understand better interpersonal and institutional trust performance, the possible causes of distrust, and ways of addressing it. So, ladies and gentlemen, as this conference highlighted, we find ourselves asking some of the most essential questions of the 21st century. And these include, how can we build institutions that are worthy of the trust of their citizens? How will we consolidate democratic processes and strengthen our policy-making outcomes? And lastly, how can we improve good governance and at the same time embrace inclusive growth as our economic compass? The OECD stands ready to work together with you to address these fundamental challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fascinating discussion of your work on trust and the underpinnings of what goes into it. We'd also like to thank the OECD for its very strong leadership in work in the Global Forum on Tax and Transparency and other global initiatives that help bring the community together, pull out experiences on the ground, but help to set standards and targets for countries to reach. So now let us turn to Kevin Casas Zamora, Senior Fellow and Director of the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law Program, member of the Inter-American Dialogue, and former Vice President of Costa Rica.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much to all of you for being here, and to the organizers of this conference, and the Vice President Familiar, and my good friend Felipe López Calva. And I should say that yesterday I really enjoyed the presentation of Luis Felipe, and I'm very interested in reading the product of the work that you have been doing, which with some level of knowledge I can say that I thought was extremely sophisticated in its analysis. If you wish to speak about the future of democratic governance in Latin America, I think that it is indispensable to refer to the strengthening of the rule of law, which I think is the pending task, the most important pending task in the construction of democracy in Latin America. If you review what has gone on in the region, what has happened in the region in the recent past, you find that concerning democracy and the electoral aspect of democracy, with highs and lows, the region has made considerable progress. Electoral fraud, which was a common occurrence in the region, has become very exceptional in Latin America. With highs and lows, countries have made big progress in these aspects. When you ask about the social preconditions of democracy, the region, in spite of it all, is moving in the right direction. The progress in terms of human resources in the region is really impressive, and even with the economic deceleration, a lot of that will be preserved, or almost everything. But we don't have the same certainty that we're moving in the right direction when we talk about the rule of law. And actually, a lot of the main problems for the development of the region have to do with the rule of law, with ensuring the enforcement of the law. Corruption, civil insecurity, is legal certainty. All of those are aspects that fall under this big umbrella that is the concept of the rule of law. And so what I would like to do is to focus on one of those problems, which was mentioned in Professor Seligson's presentation, and is corruption. I was going to talk about security, but I will focus on corruption because we don't have so much time. And corruption offers in the region an interesting story, which is less negative than we think, even though it doesn't look that way right now. As it has been said throughout these 2 days, in the last few years we have seen reactions, unprecedented reactions in Latin America against corruption, social reactions, but also institutional ones. And it suffices to say the paradigmatic case of Guatemala, where a social movement, a very broad one, ended up by demanding the renouncement of the president, and not just that, but its prosecution. And we have seen the social protesting on Honduras. We have seen what has happened in Chile, which has been mentioned here, what's happening in Brazil, and what we are seeing here is a very new thing. An interesting question is what Michael Reed said yesterday. It is if this is due to the existence of more corruption than before. And when we do a review of the data on the behavior of corruption in Latin America, which is very imperfect data that has a lot of the problems, but it is the data that we have. When we review the data, the short answer is no. There isn't any more corruption than before. At least that's not what the figures are saying in most of the countries. And I will give you just 2 or 3 pieces of information. If you take the information of the POP, 20% of the population in Latin America had paid a bribe in Latin America in 2016, and 19% had paid a bribe in 2014. So that practically has not changed. If you take the data of Latino Barometro, in 2006, 38% of the population of Latin America had known directly about the corruption action. In 2015, that figure had gone down to 27%. If you take not just the victimization figures, but the perception of corruption, and you take the index of Transparency International, you see that in the last decade the index of perception of corruption has improved in 13 of the 28 countries of Latin America, and it has increased for the region as a whole. So, we don't have clear evidence that says that there has been a dramatic worsening, neither of the victimization for corruption or of the perception of corruption. So what has changed then? What has changed, I think? The social attitudes towards corruption and the context in which corruption takes place. In the first place, there is less social tolerance for corruption, and I will give you information from La Pop. In 2006, 1 out of 4 people in Latin America said that a bribe was justified in some circumstances. 1 out of 4 people. 8 years later, in 2014, that figure had lowered to 1 out of 6. That was a fast change. What has changed is the brutal expansion of internet, and especially the social networks in Latin America. This is something that has been mentioned here. This has an impact in many ways in what's happening. First of all, with social networks, information about corruption circulates a lot faster. And there is a possibility of building in a much easier manner the social narration of what happens around the corruption cases. But social networks also reduce the costs for collective action, the cost for assembling social movements around the issue of corruption, and they also allow, as we have seen it in Latin America, for leaderless protests to emerge, which is something that would have been impossible previously. And here I want to emphasize one thing. When one of the explanations that you hear about this is that people find out about corruption, know more about corruption because the press is more free in Latin America. But watch out, because when you check the figures of freedom of the press in Latin America, you see a considerable deterioration. So what's really happening in terms of circulation of information about corruption is due specifically to the social networks. In Latin America, there's more middle class, and this is a more complicated story, because even though it is true that, for example, in Brazil, in the last decade, there are 9 more million of taxpayers. But it's not so clear, and what we repeat in Latin America, that it's a middle class that pays taxes, middle class that uses public services, and things are much more complicated than that, and this has been mentioned here. But what is true, and we have a lot of evidence about that, is that the middle-income groups are much more active politically. They participate more in the elections and in the protests. So we have a mass of people that is a lot more plugged into the political discussion than 10 years ago. Economic deceleration is another change in Latin America. Economic deceleration does not imply, and this is a key factor, a deceleration of the expectations of welfare. When you see the figures of Latino Barometro for 2015, the percentage of people in Latin America who are convinced that their economic situation and that of their family will improve in the next year, that figure in 2015 is higher than in 2010. And that gap between the expectations of welfare and the capacity of the economies to meet those expectations is growing every day. And there is a piece of information here that is interesting that comes from work done by colleagues of Professor Seligson's. The political effect of the perception of corruption is dramatically different when corruption happens in an economy that is working well than when it is in an economy that is not working well. The perception of corruption may be exactly the same, but the political effect, the punishment derived from that perception is dramatically different. What we see in Latin America is that there is a general anger because of the deceleration, an anger with the incumbent, and the corruption is providing a very important narrative to channel that anger. Ultimately, and I would like to insist on this factor, the change is that in Latin America there's a lot more transparency. When you review the last 20 years in the region, one of the notable things that you may find is that there has been a patient creation of a new regulatory construct in the region that tends to increase transparency and accountability, and that starts by the ratification of all the countries, of all the international agreements against corruption, through the approval of modernization laws of controlling institutions, the requirement of asset declarations by elected officials, laws of campaign financing, and we could, etc., we could have a long discussion of the problems for implementation of these laws, which are a lot. But I am absolutely certain that those laws have generated a lot of information, and especially they have given a lot of power to the citizens, the press, attorneys and judges to make questions and require answers. So what we see in the recent corruption scandals is not the failure of that regulatory apparatus, but its success. In a way, we are harvesting, we are collecting the harvest of scandals that regulatory construct that the region has created would eventually produce. But there is a key aspect of that. If I ask you here, we are all in favor of greater transparency, but transparency has a healthy effect for political systems in the long term, but in the short term, its effect is demolishing. That harvest of scandals weakens the legitimacy of democratic institutions in the short term. The creation of this regulatory apparatus for accountability and transparency is one of the most important aspects and one of the least recognized, I believe, of the democratic consolidation of Latin America. The corruption scandals show the big pathologies in our political systems, but they also show that in some aspects the rule of law and democracy is finally taking root in the country, in the region. And here I have a reflection related to inequality. There is a empirical relation that has been shown by a whole current of literature that has been published in the last few years between economic inequality and corruption. It's a relation that goes along trust, the point that Professor Seligson was mentioning. It is not a coincidence that in all the indexes of transparencies and integrity that we know, the Nordic countries appear in the first places. I suspect that there, corruption is not seen just as an assault on the public finances, but also as a transgression to a social contract that includes all the citizens as equals in their rights and duties. The corruption scandals that we are seeing reflect in a very crude manner the privileges of that permeate through our societies. They confirm a perception of inequality that is very extended, a perception that institutions are at the service of a very small group in society. And I'm not making this up. If you take the figures of Latino Barometro, that perception that the political system protects the interests of a very small group of society is shared by over 2/3 of the population of Latin America. So we should become serious in Latin America in order to build more equitable societies, and this is essential for combating corruption. It is essential for supporting the rule of law and ultimately for giving democracy a future in the region that justifies all the struggles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr.
Gracias, señor Casa Zamora. Creo que
Corruption and how that plays out in building trust in society or lack of trust is extremely important. And you've highlighted the very important role that transparency and information has played in changing the culture of impunity that has existed previously, and in trying to bring new standards and parameters for society to move forward on this. So we'll now turn to Haroldo Cedras, Minister and President of the Tribunal de Contas da União, the TCU in Brazil. We know Brazil has had some excitement lately on these issues, and the TCU has been leading the way, and so we thank you for your remarks.
Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everybody. Let me welcome all authorities. Let me welcome representatives of the World Bank, ladies and gentlemen, speakers. It is a privilege for me to represent the Accounts Court of Brazil in this conference, whose purpose is to find new ways that Latin America and Caribbean countries can move on in the promotion of transparency and accountability, especially at the level of government, in order to strengthen growth of nations in a fair and sustainable way. On this occasion, I must express my deep appreciation to Uruguay, a country that we recognize as an excellent neighbor and a good friend to all Brazilians, a country that has made a lot of progress in terms of public transparency, one of the key topics during this conference. At the same time, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for the invitation to participate, which is a great honor. It has been a very successful conference, bringing together speakers and panel members from all over the world and of the highest level. Now I would like to request your permit to continue speaking Portuguese so that my presentation is more fluid. The scenario of economic diversity
pela América Latina,
in America, where our states have experienced a very low rhythm of growth, government people face challenges, the typical challenges of developing countries, and among them, to maintain fiscal balance and monetary stability, and also to rationalize public spending. And the priority would be to invest in key sectors like education, infrastructure, and technological innovation. There are many obstacles for national development that originate in management inefficiency. For example, insufficient treatment of or management of risk, deficiency of projects that lead to poor implementation of investment. To overcome such difficulties, I believe that it is important for Latin American countries to try to improve governance by carrying out more efficient public policies and to render services that are of interest to the population so as to promote social and economic growth. In this context, TCU has tried its best to really improve mechanisms in terms of governance in the field of public administration at the federal level of Brazil, and also to improve investment in certain areas like in the regulation of public services to ensure transparency before all agents involved. In terms of infrastructure, TCU in the last few years has conducted audits in very relevant issues for the development of Brazil. For example, the quality of telephone services, the rates for electrical energy, railways, concessions at airports and ports, waterways, and the most recent exploration of private initiatives in gas and natural oil extraction. All these steps provide specific benefits to society with a reduction of rates and improvement of services rendered to users. In terms of investments, a very healthy environment for business requires the presence of independent regulatory bodies that are empowered with the right governance infrastructure to meet their ends, so as to avoid that the interest of the incumbent government may affect them. I also highlight steps taken by TCU to control public financing in the federal level, because this provides a technical perspective that is more independent in areas such as transparency, regularity, and above all, anticipating aspects that are fundamental to maintain trust and aspects that contribute to economic growth and also the progress of our democratic institutions. This performance by TCU is only possible given the very large mandate that we have for TCU in Brazil. This is part of the federal constitution. This is an all-embracing nature that allows it to audit public financing. This model, I would say, has multiple facets and is a paradigm on the potential and relevance of the work of different higher fiscalization and control institutions. There are many in Latin America that monitor fiscal sustainability of national states, looking to guarantee democracy in the management of public resources. In the technological field, and here I will tell you that I'm for all these innovations that come and bring a revolution to mankind. I cannot then but share what I feel about this new paradigm and what it means to our administration for developing skills and capacities in the case of higher technology for service rendering, in access to information and ensuring transparency, in co-participating of the public in public policies. And this all leads to this new concept, which is digital governance, which also brings about another pillar, which is, as we experienced in the past with the analogic governments or electronic governments. But in Brazil, we did not get to that point. So now we are trying to have a digital governance, which is going to be more definite. And for this to be successful, we must ensure the co-participation of all citizens. So, led by TCU, the executive power of Brazil, after studies started in 2015, installed the Digital Governance Policy, or PGD, which takes into account the following principle: to approach the needs of the society, data openness and transparency, sharing the capacity of services, simplicity, priority for digital services, safety and privacy, and above all, what we want to achieve is participation and social control, so that the government is not protecting data or keeping black boxes for itself. We want governments to work with open platforms of innovation. So, in terms of transparency, I think that this question is going beyond publicity and advertising. We should understand it as part of the essence of the government action. And the government should be looking for more openness and access to citizens. The concept of democratic accountability, in my opinion, implies broad access to information and the objectives of the public sector. And at TCU, we are working with open data and not protected data in order to justify our choices, our actions, our results, but above all, not only in front of citizens, but also to work in connection with the National Congress, which allows learning about social aspects on a permanent basis. In this sense, access to information became a value, a global value. Above all, at a time when national states are facing economic crisis that stem from a crisis in confidence. And we remember the recent crisis started in the US, and we verified that all national states today are mistrustful of certain data from the most famous risk assessment agencies. And we more than ever want to have our own bodies doing control about what's happening in our own country. And we will resort to new tools that will allow us to transfer more quickly all information about information disclosure that will bring transparency. At this time, we are living today, credibility of information, as was highlighted by former speakers, is a fundamental good, public good. I would say it's a sine qua non condition to create market confidence. The capacity to attract investment is more connected to the decision of providing trustworthy numbers that are carefully audited and certified before any decision is made by other economic agents. So transparency is today more embracing than what it was initially for government administration in Brazil. And I'm talking about the prevalence of fundamental democratic values that will be reflected in the economic growth of countries with direct effects on the lives of our citizens or fellow citizens. So we are aware about the economic and social benefits of this action, and we are fostering this movement through this publication that I'm showing you. There are 5 reasons why we open up data in public administration. This is a forum for discussion that we started last year from this viewpoint of having a more digitalized country. We want a Brazil that is 100% digital in the near future. And the court did important fiscalization in this regard. And the first took place in 3 very important education bodies in Brazil. The second has to do with evaluating open data policy by the federal executive power of Brazil to coordinate this policy to the law on open data. Every day we have more and more governments that realize that societies have evolved and have transformed very quickly their dynamics, incorporating technological dynamics in daily life, changing the way in which people and companies relate and produce goods and services. We cannot stay outside this, and we have to we had the support of several distinguished officials in our country and other courts of accounts in different Latin American countries that with whom we share this transparency. We are living in a digital area, so today the state cannot be what it was in the past, and I'm referring to Brazil, a country that is analogical, linked to paperwork, and with a bureaucracy that is so entrenched. On the contrary, we need to develop and become more digital. So we have to change our mindset and create a virtuous way to consolidate an innovative government that is open to society, that is providing and representing proposals that are very agile. So we will eliminate all bureaucratic obstacles that limit the competitiveness of a country and limits the growth of a country such as Brazil. In this context, I would like to tell you that the court is controlling the use of digital technology so that they become part of our modernization strategy. And in this work, we are trying to identify criteria and recommendations to install quality digital services. And this vision aligns with current efforts in other countries. We have seen several examples here. Whether at the level of governments, whether at the level of fiscal bodies, and so on. For this reason, the United Nations have sought this support to help us carry out our objectives, and this is an important point of support for sustainable development. We are aware that we have a vision to contribute to improve public administration, especially all that has to do with following the guidelines set forth by the United Nations. We also want to carry out strategic action and orient our government programs and plans, and we need to think, decide, and do that now, and do it quickly, so that we can change the role of the state according to our social and economic reality, things that we have learned over time and matured over time. This leads us to reflect on the role of innovation as a tool to evolve during this century, and that will depend on governments and the processes they choose to overcome obstacles and get to real results. We will incorporate this idea, and we will be able to raise the bar in terms of efficiency, and we will respond to those who trust in us. We have played our role, we have improved our processes, we have innovated in the control activities. For this reason, for example, we are now installing our innovation and training laboratory called Colabi. It provides training in data analysis and several educational initiatives that will increase the skills of our people. It was inaugurated in 2015, and it's available to our partners in Latin America. It was the first of its kind. I will also understand that our educational actions don't stop there. TCU is also preparing and transforming an institute which is going to be a corporate university, and we will ensure that all our staff is well trained. And this institute is also available to our partners worldwide. We have face-to-face courses and distance courses for all those who are interested. This change is not only due to the new building, new laboratories and libraries, but also with the contact with different trainers and researchers and experts that will help us improve the training of public sector workers. What we do is very broad and complex. I don't have much time. I wish I had an extra minute, but I know it's very difficult, but sometimes we cannot do that. But let me say, regarding the role of TCU as a promoter of innovation, there are some intelligent control initiatives like audits in certain geo-referenced public works. We have apps for mobile instruments. We have forecasting audits, we use new algorithms for the semantic analysis of text, and we also use data mining, among other technologies that we have. In terms of development, we have a permanent control system. We have over 55 million social benefits to detect anomalies in the family cash transfers that take place in Brazil. So we are at a stage where we are disseminating this analysis for all fields. Meanwhile, the digital transformation of the process should not be limited to control institutions. This should be extended to all government organizations as well as companies in Brazil and Latin America. I am convinced that when that happens, all countries will experience a new century of economic development. I do believe firmly that there is no development without cooperation. TCU over the last few years has expanded its links at the international level in order to be more qualified to face current challenges. In this regard, no doubt that in the last few years at OLACEF, which is the Organization of Latin American and Caribbean control entities, we have been contributing all our expertise, and we will stay available to work with them at the level of INTOSAI and work for the professional standards at an international level. TCU is part of internal subcommittees, also at INTOSAI. We were elected as from 2017 to hold the chair of the World Organization, PSC, Professional Standards Committee. In this endeavor, we have the support of all Latin American partners, and we will share this throughout the region so that they can all tap on the expertise and enrich the different levels of government throughout the region. I'm about to finish my presentation, but we can resort to cooperation to disseminate these techniques and to enhance efficiency and have more positive impact on the citizens. Let me emphasize the relevant role of institutions that help us in cooperation, like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the German agency GIZ, United Nations through UNDP, that supports our projects, and they are very much concerned with enhancing efficiency, transparency, and open government in the countries of our region. So I apologize for my very long presentation, but I know these words that I'm conveying to you come with a lot of strength from my own conviction about from my expertise being a minister of this institution for the last 9 years. And this is how we contribute to improve the situation in our country and responding to the needs of our society. So I wish to thank you all for your tolerance, for your patience, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Gracias por hablar de la importancia del monitoreo y
and also the importance of information and transparency in helping to assist the feedback loops that can help construct a better dialogue between citizens and the state. So for our last speaker, let me turn to Luis Alberto Portorizo, Senior Advisor for Strategy and Organizational Development at the Organization of American States.
Buenos días. Quiero agradecer en primer lugar.
I want to thank the organizer for allowing us to participate in this event that is so important for all of us. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you, Minister dear Danilo, for this opportunity. I thought that by speaking last, everything that I was planning to say would have been said already. So what I tried was to assemble a presentation that says the same thing in a different way, so that it's not so boring, at least. First of all, I'd like to speak about democracy because governance is completely related with the capacity of providing services, of delivery of services of the government. And this is very much connected with one of the two legitimacies of any democracy. First of all, any democracy has a legitimacy of origin, and that is that the government is elected in free and transparent elections. And then any democracy has a exercise legitimacy, and that is that government does what the people voted for them to do, and specifically that they guarantee access to human rights in a constitutional manner by the government. That's the legitimacy of exercise, and we have in the continent, as Kevin mentioned, a lot of progress concerning legitimacy of origin and exercise, but we still have several points pending concerning that, and especially in the legitimacy of exercise, which is directly related to governance. I will try to show that democracies have intrinsically 4 problems that prevent them from being perfect. There will always be faults in democracy, at least in representative and republican democracies as we know them in our continent, and what is needed is to see how we strengthen democracy to compensate for those drawbacks. And that is related to what we could call the problems of translation. How do you transfer a set of principles and values, a set of moral principles that the populations vote at a given time, to a set of policies, to a set of rules? How do you do this transference? Because when people vote, they think that this is better than this other thing. And if this is better than this other thing, it means that this is right and this is less right and this is wrong. And that is moral. To say that this is right and this is wrong, that is moral. So when people vote for a set of moral principles. So how do you translate moral principles into concrete policies? First problem. I am in the country of José Gervasio Artigas, so I can't avoid remembering him. He said, "My authority comes from you, and it stops before your sovereign presence." And that is the part of the agent problem. The population delegates authorities on a government for 4 or 5 years, but that authority belongs with the people. The people is the principal, and the politicians and the people in government are the agents. And that's the problem, that the objectives of the people do not always meet the objectives of the principals. So we will always have problems in democracies. We will always have a translation problem, because there will always be unhappiness by the population concerning what they chose and what is being implemented. There's a second problem, is also intrinsic of democracy, that is the knowledge. We owe it to a Nobel Prize of Economy, Arrow, who showed that the rule of the majority is unstable when we talk about divisible goods. That is, if we have to assign resources between 2 parties, relative power of those parties may determine that that assignment is 60-40, or 50-50, or 70-30, but once defined, that assignment is stable. But if there's 3 of us, then there could be coalitions, so that initial 60-40, then 2 get together to regulate the 60-40 so that it is 30-20-10. But the next day, 2 others may get together and it's 60-20-20. So this may seem simple, but the rule of the majority is unstable. When we talk about divisible goods and when we're doing policies, we are assigning resources, so we're talking about divisible goods. And this is an intrinsic problem of democracy. We will always have this problem. And there's an additional element, and that is, how do these coalitions play versus those who voted and versus those who are influencing on those coalitions. And we get to the third element, thus. The politicians are not guided by the preferences of people. Politicians are guided by the preferences that people express. The more they express themselves, the more the politicians will be concerned. If there's a mobilization, if there's a demonstration about a topic, the whole political system will try to decide that topic for months. And it might not have anything to do with what was voted, but the politicians will react to before the preferences that are expressed. And how are these preferences expressed in representative and republican democracies? First of all, through political parties, then through organizations of civil society such as trade unions, of companies or workers or other institutions of the civil society. What is new? What has been said here? That Kevin mentioned about corruption. We are before a new citizenship. There's a new citizenship in the world. It's not just the middle class in the continent. There's a new citizenship that is an interconnected citizenship. It's a citizenship that has cascading information, not just about corruption. They have cascading information about everything related to public policy, and they have an opinion about everything. They use the trade unions used to have an opinion, or the political parties, but now they have opinions in the social networks, and they get mobilized, as Kevin said, but it's like fireworks, as I call it. Why? Because there's a topic that appears, it has a huge visibility like a firework. During a week it explodes and then it disappears, and then another one appears. This is fireworks with a difference. Fireworks leave in our retina an idea of satisfaction. In the social networks, these fireworks leave in the interconnected citizenship a feeling of frustration, because the issue was that they mobilized about was not resolved, where they did a campaign through the networks or even in the streets. And why wasn't it resolved? For another aspect that is also related to the failures of democracies. I don't want to say failures, but they are intrinsic characteristics of democracies. Differently from what my economist colleagues believe, governing is not maximizing a welfare function. Governing is managing the relative power of the agents. When you do economic policy, what you're managing is the political economy of that economic policy. When you do educational policy, you're managing the economic policy of that educational policy. And thus, with every aspect. So my economist colleagues are not right. You don't manage welfare, you manage power, and this interconnected citizenship does not have power. It has a power of expression, but it does not have a lobbying power, as the traditional organizations of democracy have. And that's where we have the problem. We have the problem that in terms of trends and uncertainties, this traditional institutional democracy is at stake. It's at stake also the capacity of response of our institutions before a citizenship that does not feel it is represented. And there's a fourth element that is connected with these problems that we will always have because they are intrinsic to democracy. And this is what, when you vote for a government, you vote for a future. You think that that government will give you what you haven't had so far. But in order to get that future, the government inherits institutions from the past. Economic institutions, political institutions coming from the past. And we have there what we call our past dependence. And this happens in the institutions. And what we have in all the countries is generations of institutions that overlap through time and that determine our future. But we don't have the institutions to face that future. When that future is identical to the past, no problem. But this is not the time that we are living. We are living at the time when the future doesn't have anything to do with the past. And I will start, since this seminar was about governance and development, talking about development. The continent developed in the last few years by doing more things than it was doing and doing them better. And that's why it fell in the trap of the middle income. The middle income trap is that we did better and more of the same things that we had been doing before. How can you come out of this middle income trap? By diversifying, doing other things, doing new things. That's how the currently developed countries develop themselves, by diversifying the productive matrix. It is necessary for economic institutions, the rules of the game that were mentioned yesterday, to innovate, to seek productive diversification for development and political purposes. Because when a country has one product and it lives off one product, winners take all. And that country will become radicalized. It's very conflicted because winner takes all, because there's only one source for generation of wealth. When that country has few alternatives in their productive matrix, few take all. It's no winner take all, but very few become the oligarchy that will guide the power relations, will capture and regulate the regulator in an implicit manner. If we wish to have a democracy that spreads in terms of spreading out power and prevents a concentration of power, then the productive diversification allows agreements between different social and economic stakeholders that are not conflictive and they are not radicalized. In Uruguay, I cannot forget to say that Uruguay is the best at confronting this economic situation, because Uruguay has been successful in diversifying its productive matrix, both in terms of products and in exportation of services. It's not a coincidence that it's in a better situation than others that did not achieve that diversification, because this diversification also implies, in terms of development, to face another challenge for the continent. The whole continent has developed. They have gotten people out of poverty, distributing income better, but they have not been able to overcome the problem of social mobility that was shown in the report today. We have an enormous problem of social mobility that leaves the society in stagnant compartments where parts of the population have their own culture. I like to point out an example, and that is when I was a child, a very humble neighborhood, we wanted to be doctors. Our parents wanted us to be doctors, and we dreamt of being doctors ourselves. 20 years ago, in that humble neighborhood, the children dreamt of being football player, and nowadays they want to be drug traffickers. So we have a very serious problem that society has become fragmented, and the poorest population has become the army of drug trafficking. And so we have not been able to get the distribution of income to be accompanied by social mobility policies. We need not only in the productive diversification, but we also need policies of social mobility. These are the challenges for development. No, there are a lot more. There are many more, but I will not mention them, but I'll leave them. This is an exercise that we did in the OAS with some experts from all of Latin America to see which are the main challenges in terms of development, which was the probability of occurrence of the phenomena, and what was the impact, high or low. So what you have a high probability and high impact, that's what we will try to prioritize. And what's in the middle has a high variance in the answers. In the middle we have uncertainties on which we are working in different scenarios. This work has not been finished. For your enjoyment, I will not present it now because I would need 2 hours, but the most important thing is what I was pointing out, the importance of new economic institutions, new social institutions, productive diversification, and social mobilization as main pillars. And we did the same exercise for democracy, but we did it also for two other elements because we found this. And here I will ask for one more minute. What do these graphs say? That everything is related to everything else. The points that you see there are countries. What we did was 36 variables of democracy, development, human resources, and security. We summarized them into four based on those four pillars that are the four pillars of the OAS. And we clustered the countries, and we found that the clusters are the same. Those that are up there, high up on the left, the three circles are always the same in all the variables. Canada, United States, and Uruguay. It's always the same concerning development, democracy, human rights, and security. And that one at the bottom, the last one, is always the same in all the cases, in all the variables. Haiti. And those in the middle in two differentiated groups, one over the median and the other one below the median, is always the same countries too. So this shows what the OAS has always defended, and it is the interdependence that exists between development, human resources, security, and democracy. It's an interdependence that we note in our reality when we see in many parts of our continent. There are neighborhoods in cities, there are towns, entire regions where the state cannot go in because the drug trafficking is the government, is the lead. This is completely related to security is completely related to human resources of the human rights of the people, to development, and to the capacity of the state to exercise the monopoly of democracy in the land. These four elements are related, and so when we speak about democracy, we need to talk about human rights, and when we talk about security, we need to talk about democracy, and when we talk about development, we have to talk about democracy, human rights, and security. In order to close, before I get my little paper again, we are at a change of times, both from an economic point of view, where the elements that explain the development of the continent up till now will not explain it in the future. I was in China 15 days ago, and the Vice Minister explained his own strategy, the strategy of China, which is completely different from the one they have used in the last 15 years. It's a different country, and it will be a different country. They are promoting internationalization of their companies. The Chinese companies should go out to produce outside of China, so they will not demand raw materials anymore because they will produce in other countries, and they will promote services for the middle class that they have developed. So it's a completely different pattern of development, and we will have to adapt to that. We will have to realize that the world has changed, and we have to seek other ways. We have to innovate concerning economic aspects, but as I was saying, also in the political institutions. The worst thing we can do is consider democracy a McDonald's franchise, like a Western franchise for countries to reproduce it. That's the worst thing we can do, because there we would be freezing an institution or a set of institutions that are in question because of the interconnected citizenship. It is true, having a franchise reduces uncertainty of unknown alternatives. It is true. It's not the same for an entrepreneurial business person, somebody who manages a franchise. In the franchise, everything is solved. If you want to copy a franchise, a lot of things will be solved. But if you have problems with that franchise, you will have problems, and the problems I have described. So we need to allow ourselves to think about innovation from the point of view of political institutions also. My Brazilian colleague was giving an example, and Kevin also mentioned it, and Mary also mentioned it. And I don't remember. I will try to avoid pronouncing the last name just that I don't embarrass myself. And the importance that the new opening of the governments, that open governments are not just top-down. It's not just showing information, but they are also bottom-up. They give participation to the citizenship, and that interconnected citizens for the planning of public policies, so that this citizenship that is frustrated because they don't feel represented, they start to feel listened to and represented in the design of public policies. And not just the government, because what is at stake here is also the political parties that are the basis of democracy. Political parties also should open up. It is also civil society, the trade unions, the entrepreneurial and worker trade unions that should open to the participation of people for design and implementation of their activities. But it is also other institutions that also have a lot of influence, because we should respect the freedom of expression, but also access to public information by the citizens, and that is communication media, should also open up to see how they take their decisions, about how they make the decision of using one headline and not another. They should open so that the people get the capacity to give their opinion, because the media and the press are also a fundamental pillar of democracy. And today, just like political parties, just like the unions, they are losing credibility. And yesterday the Minister Astori said it very clearly, and I will repeat it with a few spices. Also private companies. Private companies have to have cuentas claras, clear accounts, because there are no corrupt without corrupting people. The corrupt only exist when somebody corrupts them. So go to the source. Where is the money that corrupts them? And at that source we also have to have transparency, and we have to do clear accounts, because that's where you see who pays the corrupt.
So thank you. The new global citizenship, old institutions, activity both in the public sector and the private sector to think through how we move forward and resolve these problems. So that, following on issues of trust, issues of justice and impunity, and issues related to oversight and monitoring, help us to think about all the issues that we face in moving forward. Do we have time for a few questions? So 3 questions, one from here, one from here. So, sir, over there, and any other questions? No, so one question right there.
Pergunta lá. Depois passaremos à próxima sessão.
King. This meeting, these 2 days, we have talked about accountability and clear accounts, rendering of accounts and accountability. We have talked about accountability. And this has to do with numbers. How do private companies make decisions? How do organizations make decisions? At least they have a balance sheet or a statement of accounts that shows how the net worth varies from one year to another. Why is it that governments do not have such documents that show the difference between one year and the next? How you went from one net worth to another, where you include all the revenues and all the spending, all the amortizations, the deterioration of infrastructure like roads and buildings and so on. That
Muito provavelmente dirigida aos órgãos de controle.
I'm speaking. I have this responsibility to answer. I would say that this concern is a permanent concern, that in the past the external control used auditing methods that solved the situation, that provided the legal aspects of the performance. for all the answers that we have to give to our societies, we need to move a step forward. That is why we try to learn something, and this is what we are doing precisely in Brazil. This is what we call the financial audits that I mentioned. Our model is FRASA. We have partnerships with other countries and institutions. We have a very efficient cooperation with other institutions. We are doing peer review so that we know what we are doing and how we are doing it. And this is something we share in an open way. And we are permanently doing peer work oversight. And we have learned a lot. I think that this is a way in which we can safeguard the economy. UN is also concerned about avoiding economic crisis, and we have to control both the private and the public sectors. But we are trying to change some concepts and steps that we take for action so that we can use what is called the forecasting or ongoing audits that were not used in the past. We are trying to include this in the strategic planning, and we are doing this in some sectors in Brazil. So we want to analyze the first experiences and good results and share them with our international partners. And then we were planning to create governance indices, and new knowledge that is arriving is being used, but things happen so quickly and in such a surprising way that I do not know what's going to happen in the end. Maybe we will be using more technology or virtual reality or mixed reality, which combines what is virtual with face-to-face experiences. This is something new. I don't know what is going to happen in the future, but this is our effort at least. Muchas gracias.
Produce that kind of information where you can see.
Obrigado por essa informação. De todas as informações, você pode ver a Casa Fiscal com todas as informações que fiquem, que sejam bem controladas e facilitados os processos. Porque tem
to have a look at kind of other outcomes of the policies, and that is what we have been trying to help at the OECD by our Better Life initiative, where we go beyond the GDP, where we measure the overall well-being in a country with several indicators, and via that we can then give information also to governments that how they have succeeded in their work. So what is needed is all that what Mr. Serras said, but also what has to be done is to get a good picture of that, how all the policies implemented then affect ordinary people.
With that, let me thank our panelists for the very interesting views and perspectives that they've brought to the table, and now we'll move on to the closing session.